So I don't really have any recollection of when my dad left, but my mom always told me it was somewhere around between 5 and 6 years old, and she always says, don't say that your dad left. I told him to go. And shortly after that, my mom started replacing the alarm clock with Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison and Bob Dylan. So I grew up in a house of music with my two brothers, and shortly after, she brought home one day, she worked in a bar, and one day she brought home an acoustic guitar, and that became like kind of like the thing that my brother and I used to sort of wrestle over who would they get the chance to play the guitar, and it was always something that we came from the same background, and it's something when I connect it today, you know, it is that strumming Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, Roy Orbison, and it's been with me all along the road. And then, you know, then the school started, and this in the sort of rough neighborhood I was living in had, you know, a youth club very close to where we lived, and after school I would go over there and had a music teacher there, and basically the only thing the music teacher taught me, he gave me the lyrics and the chords to Knocking on Heaven's Door with Bob Dylan. He says, this is all you need. This is the foundation to everything. And it for me, it kind of became the foundation of everything. It's almost like I say so many ways that every song I've written, I've used the same 5 chords that Bob Dylan used in Knocking on Heaven's Door, and then once in a while throw 2 more in it, and then you have the entire Mike Tramp catalog. And you know, little by little, you know, I started getting a little bit more into music, and one day I got approached by a strange looking man, the kind of man that your mom warns you about, do never talk to this, but it happened to be that the guy was living in the basement of our apartment building. And one thing that I'd noticed was that once in a while, like 4 or 5 guys would show up with long hair and go down there in the basement, and the door would be closed, and I never knew what was going on in there. But I found out that this guy was sole responsible for every music magazine in the late 60s and early 70s in Denmark. And these were the local bands that came down there, had their picture taken and doing interviews. And then one day he sees me walk over to the youth club with the guitar, and he asked me, oh, you like music? Would you like to take it any further? And I said, well, yeah, I love music. And then he invited me down there and showed me what he was doing. And he basically was sitting there and making all these magazines, like Cream magazine, like Tiger Beat, just the Danish version of it. And of course I started getting introduced to the international scene, and you know, he was really teeny bopper, so it was David Cassidy, it was Donny Osmond and Basie the Rollers and stuff like that. So after school I used to come down there and sat for a couple of hours and work with him. And my first task was to open all the letters that these young teenage girls would write in, thinking they were writing personally to Donny Osmond and David Cassidy. And it basically became my sexual education, because as I opened these letters, they would be like, oh, dear Donny, I'm 15 years old, but should it be that I one time would be in your hotel room, this is what I would like us to do. And I kept going through letter on letter, and sometimes I would call my mom, I'm going to come home late for dinner, and I'll just go through all this. And it became an introduction to the world that later on I was staying right in the middle when I was on stage with White Line in 1988, and the backstage was full of girls. I would never have put these two things together, that at age 14 I'll be sitting and reading these letters. And then sometime around when I turned 15, he says, tonight we're going to a concert. I want you to see a live band in action, but you cannot wear the kind of clothes you're wearing. So he took me to one of the only shops in Copenhagen that sold the cool English rock clothes, the stuff that came from London, Carnaby Street and stuff like that. The platform boots that Sweet and Slade and Gary Glitter and Bowie and all those guys had on, man. And he bought me a pair like that, and like, you know, flower power boot, you know, pants and like satin jackets. And I told him, I can't walk through my neighborhood in this. They're gonna beat me up by the time they see me out on the street. So the concert hall was the other side of the train station. So I put the clothes in a plastic bag, and when I got to the train station, I went into a toilet and changed and walked out the other way and into this concert hall. And that night, the band that was playing obviously was only drawing girls. I was the only guy amongst 2,000 screaming girls. There was like that classic screaming as loud as you know, Shea Stadium with the Beatles. You couldn't hear the band. That night, it was the Bay City Rollers in 1976. But the story is that the band that played before them was Denmark's own teen band. And the next day in the newspapers, it stood that the manager from Bay City Rollers had stolen Mabel, which was the name of the band before, young lead singer, and taking him all the way to Scotland where Bay City Rollers had the camp. And now these three guys from the band came into this little apartment that you know, my friend and was doing the magazine. Then they're sitting there and asking if he could find a new singer for him. And meanwhile, you know, my friend is sitting there looking at me and saying, okay, this is what's going to happen. Here's your new singer. And 2 weeks later on, I went out to their house and did an audition, totally unprepared, because I never really wanted to be in music. I just liked music. But they put me into one of the bedrooms. They were living in one house by themselves. And there's a Marshall stack, you know, ready for Jimi Hendrix to come in there. And they give me guitar and says, can you play? And I'm sitting there with nothing but feedback and saying, I don't know. So he says, we'll get back to you. And then an hour later, after I've been sitting in the room fiddling with the guitar, they come in and say, we think we can make you work. And that night, I stayed in that house, and it was in the middle of the school summer vacation. And the day before school was about to start again, I called my mom and says, Mom, I'm not going to come back to school. And my mom was, oh. And then I talked to her about that this band wanted me to be the singer and stuff like that. He says, you know what, on Monday, let's go and talk to your school teacher. So we went to talk to my school teacher, and my mom goes, as naive as she was, is it possible for my son to get a 2-week trial period with a rock band? And the school teacher just looked at her and says, if your boy misses the first week of school, by no means can he catch up to the rest of the class. But my mom let me go and join the band, and at age 15 and a half, I moved away from home, and since that day, I have lived 100%, 42 years later, from rock and roll, and never ever asked my mom for one little thing. My mom always used to say, well, it's one less plate of food on the table. And so, you know, we became like the first boy band sort of in Denmark, but you know, we were playing real guitars and stuff like that. And after a few years, we had just had too much of the way we were being treated in our home country, that we had gotten this opportunity to move to Spain, which is in the southern part of Europe, and suddenly these 4 blonde guys moved down to Spain, you know, where we really stood out, and we became like a teen sensation down there. I was now 18 years old. I was now writing all the songs from the band. I was now, you know, leading the band in a different direction. I'd started getting really into the American bands, the American sound, Journey, Cheap Trick, REO Speedwagon, Eddie Money, and of course Van Halen. And completely slowly started molding my way around David Lee Roth, you know, in the peak time of his career. It happens to be that we're on the same record company as Van Halen, and they are coming into Spain to do promotion for the Fair Warning album, their 4th album, you know, in my opinion, their best album. And I asked the record company, he says, you think I can go meet the band? And they say, you know what, you speak some broken Spanish. We're going to send you to the airport with 3 limousines, pick up the band, and just be along with the band for the next 3 days. We're in Madrid doing radio promotion, a TV show and stuff like that. I go, are you kidding? So I go to the airport and stand there all by myself in my little leather jacket, my Van Halen t-shirt, and my blonde hair that's just reached the shoulders. And the first guy that comes out from custom is David Lee Roth. They're the first guy they let go. And he must have been 20 feet tall when I looked at him. And you know, he's got sunglasses on and he looks really mean, and he looks around, and then he sees me. He says, there's got to be a connection between this. So he comes up to me and he says, who are you? And I go, Well, the record company has sent me here to pick you up. You got a joint? I says, not really on me. I don't really smoke, but I'm sure I know somebody who can gather it, you know. So for the next 3 days, I was with Van Halen. There weren't fans in front of the hotel rooms. Nobody really knew they were there and stuff like that. So I really got close to the band and had a really great time. And of course, at that moment, my band has just done their new album, but I changed the name of the band. The name Mabel, I didn't feel fitted anymore, so now I called the band Studs, named after the studs that sat in all the leather jackets of the new wave of British heavy metal English fans, and I read that in Melody Maker, New Musical Express. So I said, Studs, man, that's great. So one night, I'm in Davy Rother's hotel room, and we're sitting there listening to some music, and I got in a plastic bag and said, David, and this is my band. Thinking that once I give this album to him, he's going to say, and you are the next support band on the Van Halen American tour. Instead, he takes the album up and he looks at it, and he says, Studs, that ain't gonna work. They'll think you're the New Village People. And it took me about a couple of days to understand what that really meant, until the guys in the band says, maybe he thinks that we're a gay band. And shortly after, we had actually met an American at a rock club in Madrid who said to us, I'll be your manager. You can live in my house in New York. And that's all I needed to know. And 2 months later, we sold everything we owned and we flew to New York and arrived in New York City in the summer of 1982. The beginning of the 80s, the beginning of MTV, the start of David Letterman, when every rock club in New York were on fire. And it was absolutely amazing. And one night in November of 1982, I'm sitting in the dressing room in the club in Brooklyn called L'Amour's, rock capital of Brooklyn. I'm sitting there with my guys from Denmark, and in through the door walks this guitar player. It's like 11 at night. He's got sunglasses on. His Stratocaster is sort of hanging half out his broken guitar case. And I said to myself, man, what a fool. And then we had this little backstage guitar amplifier that our bass player had built, and this guy goes, oh man, can I try one of those? And I thought to myself, yeah, let him plug in and make a fool out of himself, because I thought we were the shit. And then he plugs his guitar in, man, and he starts playing, and for the next half hour, me and the rest of the guys in the band, we just sat like this. And at that moment, I knew that that was the guy that I needed to play with. And the only thought in my head was, how quickly can I get rid of the other guys in my band? Because this is the guy, and that guy was Vito Bratta, and that night became the start of White Lion. So at the end of 1982, which basically was December, the guys in the band, I think, had too much of living in New York. We hadn't had any money for half a year. We didn't make any money on the shows, but I was having a blast. I was having the best time of my life. So we go back to Denmark, and shortly after we're back in Denmark, you know, I break up the band, and I can feel it's itching in me. It says I have to go back to America, and my mom had nothing. We came from a very poor little family, and I said to Mom, I need to get out of here. I need to get back to the USA. It's the only place where I can have my hair grown long and people not yelling at me on the street and things like that. People just look at me and says, dude, you must be a rock star. And you know, it was just one of those things. So you know, my mom helped me get like a $900 bank loan in a local bank that I went up there and I bought like a one-way ticket to New York. And I came back in March of 1983, and the first night I went out to a club, and this girl came up to me and gave me a phone number. And before I even looked at the phone number, I just said, hey, this is what rock and roll is all about. I didn't even have an opening line, and she's already given me her phone number. But then I looked, and it said Vito Bratta. And that night, I called him and for like 1 hour just bullshitted my way about, man, you know, I'm so big in Europe, man, I got all these plans and stuff like that. And he did the same thing. And the next day we got together and we started talking about this plan. And there was just something from the start that, you know, we just felt that this was meant to happen. I mean, there was, you know, I was like a firecracker, man. It was like I had so much energy and things like that. And you know, shortly after we put the first version of White Line together, which was basically 2 of the guys from Vito's band, and we started out by playing all the songs that I had from my band, and little by little the other guys fell from the band, and Vito and I would always return to, oh, it's you and I again. Then we would get 2 new guys to play bass and drums, and then they would fall off. Meanwhile, Vito and I were writing the songs and stuff like that, and finally getting to that point where we had all the 10, 12 songs that we were going to take into the studio. And at that time, our managers, you know, have made this deal with a producer who owns a studio in Frankfurt, Germany, and he sends us over there and locks us in this studio out in an industrial area in Frankfurt, Germany, completely bored to shit, but 100% able to concentrating on the album. And we come back in February of 1984, get signed to Elektra Records only 2 weeks later for a massive record deal, and start all the preparation, you know, meet with the promo department, do the legendary photo shoot in front of the library. I think it's on 34th Street in Manhattan at night, and things like that, and get ready for that. And then suddenly one day we get this legendary phone call from our manager, says, we got good news and we got bad news. What do you want to hear first? And then Vito goes, give us the bad news. And then our manager goes, Electric Records have decided not to release the album and basically let you go of the contract. But the good news is you get to keep the money. Of course, we were devastated. We couldn't understand what had happened here. And suddenly, you know, we have all this money in the bank, but our baby, our album, the Fight to Survive album, is just lying on the shelf, and we can't control it. So almost a whole year goes by where the band is sort of just playing the clubs, the rhythm sections in the band leaves the band for the second time, and we get Greg D'Angelo in on drums, and that time we got Dave the Beast on bass, and we start playing the tri-state area, clubs here and there and stuff like that. And then one day our manager says to us that they got a deal going in Japan, that they were able to license the Fight to Survive. We didn't understand what that meant, but he says we got a record deal for Fight to Survive in Japan. And here is that White Lion starts in Japan, and bit by bit the local record stores, which of course existed in those days in Jersey, in New York, and all these places, started importing the Fight to Survive album from from Japan back to America, and we started building this up. And the same thing was happening in Europe. It got imported to France, to Germany, to England, and bit by bit White Line becomes like #1 on the import chart, and starting having a following on the other side of the water. Meanwhile, we're a local Staten Island, Brooklyn band, and bit by bit, which was happening in those days, the band is starting having, this is a signed band, this is a band with an official album, and things like that, you know. And then James Lomenza comes into the band, and finally now we are the complete band that tours around and plays as much as we can. And at the end of '86, Michael Wagner, who later became our producer both on the Pride album and on the Big Game album, contacts our managers and says, I like to work with the band. And at that time we don't have a new record deal, and Michael says, come out to Los Angeles, I'll find the money, I got the studio, I got the apartments for you guys to live in. And basically By the time we start recording the Pride album, we don't have a record deal yet. But our managers is working with Atlantic Records and stuff like that, and sort of almost just at the end of recording the Pride album, the record deal with Atlantic Records get signed, and you know, the whole thing starts up, the preparation for the album, the first video, the first tour together with Ace Frehley and Y&T, then another club tour where we go around, and then we got jump on with Kiss in November of '87, and only about 5 months after the album comes out does Wade starting making a bit of movements on the radio, and that is because one single radio station in Minneapolis decides to give it a little bit of a boost, and the audience are responding. And then back in those days, radio stations had their weekly trade paper that would write, this song is doing really good, audience responding, and everybody was reading. And the next week, a station in San Diego did the same thing with a single and got the same kind of response. And after that, it became wildfire, prairie fire across the country. And suddenly, we're onto a big tour in Europe, sold out tour, and I remember 3 sold out shows at the legendary Marquee Club in London, and the first night I was sharing hotel rooms with my manager, and during the night I can hear him a little bit on the phone, and suddenly he starts screaming, "We got it!" 3 months with Aerosmith starting in March. And then it's just from there, and I don't think they went about 3 weeks into the Aerosmith tour, our manager shows up. We've just gotten a commitment for AC/DC to start another 3 months tour with AC/DC 2 days after you finish with Aerosmith. And after that, we were selling 100,000 albums a week, and everything just became a crazy world where we didn't even have time to think. We just had to make sure we could catch our breath, and our hair wasn't going to fall out from all the hairspray and all that kind of thing.